Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to another Supatease video. And in this one, we've got the final countdown, the conclusion of the Shadowlands beta. Where have the melee DPS landed in terms of their power when it comes to 3 versus 3 arena in PvP for Shadowlands? That's what we will be deciding here. In my opinion, this tier list I've constructed from playing and experiencing the game myself, as well as analyzing and studying and researching a lot of other content creators to try and figure out what is actually going to be performing the best in Shadowlands, taking into consideration some things that I think other creators aren't, to try and make sure that this is as accurate as it can be. Do note that it is opinion, a little bit of guessing, but based on my personal experience from the previous expansions and anticipating things, back in Warlords of Draenor, I played Turbo Cleave. I didn't win BlizzCon, but Turbo Cleave won BlizzCon. Back in Mists of Pandaria, I played Warlock Boomkin Shaman. I didn't win BlizzCon because I'm bad, but Boomkin Warlock Shaman did win BlizzCon. I am very good at identifying compositions in the game and things that make specs good or bad. Now, can I tell you whether or not I think things will get buffed or nerfed? I usually can as well, because I've seen the trends of those things moving forward through multiple expansions. So I would like to think that my opinion here is pretty solid. And of course, I am going to give you the 4 warnings of if there's something that's standing out as potentially getting nerfed, you may want to take that as a second consideration. But this is the assessment as it is right now, with Shadowlands coming out in 4 days. We didn't receive any class changes on Wednesday, a couple Covenant nerfs specifically to Pelagos for the Kyrian, which may shake things up, but probably not for a lot of specs overall, not the main purpose of this video. But I didn't see any dramatic spec changes like we did the week prior. So I think that we've got a solid footing here for where these classes can go. So let's just get started. We've got the Arms Warrior, and this is a specialization that I had previously ranked as A tier, but now with it receiving damage buff after damage buff and having a very powerful Covenant ability in the Kyrian, I think it is undeniable that Arms Warrior, with this level of damage and the utility that it has available to itself and its personal survivability, that it's probably one of the best specs in the game, just bar none. I think that is a shared and common opinion of this specialization in terms of its performance. I think that it is also a fantastically fun specialization to play because of its high damage and its high utility. It's going to be very disruptive on the battlefield with Intervene, Ignore Pain, Spell Reflect, Overwatch, Spell Reflect. I really don't think you can go wrong at this point. I already recommended it in my class recommendations, but like, it's actually over the top. And you can see trends like this at the moment with specs that are underperforming in PvE, which Arms Warrior was one of those specs, getting buffs. As to in the future, is that going to change with a PvP specific change? I think it's in my anticipation that if I was producing Shadowlands and I was on such a tight schedule already with it being delayed, the main focus is getting dungeon tuning, getting raid tuning, because those come out and those are very competitive right away, right? You're going to have world first racers. It's very important that that is balanced the way that they want it to be balanced when that becomes available. So the tuning makes sense to be dedicated towards PvE. Whereas for PvP, when do we really care about balance, right? It's more towards the end of the season when we're competing for our titles and rewards. So I feel like if we're going to see PvP tuning, it's probably going to happen a little bit later. I would expect that Arms Warrior is one of those specs probably to receive PvP tuning because it's a spec that has such a high level of utility and high damage that it's really standing out. And I think that it's a spec that could easily be nerfed with something like a 10% less damage or 10% less strength in PvP, right? It's just like a blanket nerf. So take that into consideration, but I still think that it would be an S tier spec even if it didn't have the levels of damage that it currently does. Assassination Rogue. This is a specialization that I think is just middle of the road. It's a rogue. It can play with mages. It can play with hunters. I don't think that it is nearly as bursty as Subtlety, but it still brings Kidney Shot. It still brings Blind, and that's going to synergize and work really well with mages. So for me, I wouldn't say that there might be some bias because it hasn't changed, right? It's just assassination. You've got slice and dice now, but it's still the same thing. I wouldn't say that it's any weaker than it was in BFA. It's just other things have gotten stronger. So it's a good spec, but at the moment I just put it middle of the road. You'll do well with it. So like B is like solid. You're not you are going to function well, but you don't have anything that's dramatically over the top or a step above, just a solid spec. Enhancement Shaman, this has been one that's got a lot of stigma around it. It's been getting actually some buffs recently towards its healing. That is particularly where its strength is coming, is from Healing Surge with Maelstrom Weapon. You just provide a lot of utility. More importantly, you pair incredibly well with Arms Warrior because they can protect you, because you're very fragile as an Enhancement Shaman. And I think this synergy in particular with the high levels of damage from Arms Warrior and the healing output from Enhancement, that you're going to see a lot of combinations like that. The Warrior Enhancement Shaman coming back. But because I've seen situations like this in the past where hybrid instant healing is so high, if there are any tournaments happening or it's becoming blatantly apparent that games are going into deep dampening because the instant healing is unpreventable, I feel like this is something that has been nerfed in the past, and this isn't a new trend or something totally meta defining that's never happened before. So if Enhancement Shaman were to get its healing reduced, I think that it falls into the garbage can pretty quickly. You're going to have a lot of damage output with the Venthyr Covenant with Chain Harvest still, even despite a nerf applied to it like a month ago. It's still a really good Covenant for Enhancement Shaman. For me, I'd say Enhancement is like middle of the pack at the moment because of its healing. If you took its healing away, it would drop down in tiers. I think that if you play with an Arms Warrior, Enhancement Shaman becomes a lot better than where I'm going to put it currently as its placement. If you're going to try and play with any other partners than an Arms Warrior, I'm just basing this off the individual strength of the spec, taking into considerations the synergies. But for me, it's just a middle of the road. You're going to be able to heal a lot. If you want that secondary hybrid role, it's definitely going to fit you. I think you will perform well with an Arms Warrior, but an Arms Warrior may consider other specializations because they have the privilege of doing so from the S tier category. Feral Druid has received buff after buff after buff after buff after buff. Feral Druid does a huge amount of healing, just like Enhancement, but brings consistency in its burst through Ferocious Bite, and it's doing nasty amounts of damage. This is a spec that can just reset at any time, heal itself back to full. I would say that its healing is as obnoxious as Enhancement, but more limitless, and because of your ability to shapeshift and you're more mobile and you have many defensive cooldowns unlike Enhancement Shaman, that it makes it way better of a specialization. To me, Feral Druid with Cyclone now baseline as well, I think it's jumping up into the S tier category pretty quickly. And way back when, I think there was maybe one spec up in the S tier based on my initial assessment, and there was a ton on the A tier, but there are specs that are just leveling up a lot. Frost Death Knight, despite seeing nerf after nerf to this specialization, after watching people like Mez playing Frost Death Knight, experiencing fighting against well-versed Frost Death Knights on the beta, it seems like it still brings a huge burst setup. So to me, Frost it's transferring over from Battle for Azeroth pretty much in the same spot. Grip, double blind, set up your chill streak, burst down targets. Instead of Blood of the Enemy, you're replacing it with new Covenant abilities. It's still basically just the same. There's not too much. You get a little bit of extra utility with Lichborn and Death Coil, but in terms of its performance, it's ending up in the same sort of position that it was. It's tough for me to give this specialization too high of a placement. I think that its synergy with Windwalker Monk in particular could allow you to have a lot of success with it, but as its individual spec, will it work with other specs? Is it going to have the choice of the litter, right, in terms of playing with everybody? I don't think so. It fits into a very just scripted burst play style, and I think that that's something that also could be nerfed because, again, anything you're stacking tons of modifiers together and you're critting people for really big damage is usually subject to nerfs in PvP from what I've seen in the history of this game. So for me, I think Frost is just about middle of the pack. I don't think that it's going to be doing phenomenally amazing. It's not going to be Frost XX, right? So Frost, any class meta. It's just a solid spec overall, and it's going to have a niche and it's going to have its place. Fury Warrior received some buffs recently, so I wouldn't say that it's completely god-awful. Before I would have said that it was the worst spec in the game. I still think it probably is the worst melee spec, but it's better than where it was, right? Because it got buffed. I mean, where else would it be other than better than where it was? The main problem for Fury is just lacking a Mortal Wounds effect. You can play with Windwalker Monk, to bring the Mortal Wounds effect to the spec that otherwise doesn't have it. But again, if you're a Windwalker Monk, I mean, that Fury Warrior better be doing something special to get in a group with you, because you're a Windwalker Monk. So for me, Fury, it's not a D anymore. I think that you could make it work, but it's going to be pretty comp dependent, and you're not going to be having as much fun as you would if you were playing arms in PvP. So for me, I'm putting it on the C tier, just below the solid specs. You could make it work. It's not a total failure, but there's a dramatic difference between the two. So if you want to be the underdog hipster, go for the Fury Warrior in my mind. But if you want to go for super competitive tryhard mode, you're going to want to go for arms. Havoc Demon Hunter. This is another specialization where I feel like the class itself is not really particularly strong. It's more the Covenant, the Night Fae, and the Hunt that is allowing Demon Hunters to get huge burst damage out, much to the same as Frost Death Knights are able to get out at the moment with Chill Streak. So for me, I don't think that Demon Hunter, they're a solid spec. Remember, B tier it's solid. It's not super over the top. It probably has one thing about it that's making it strong at the moment, and it could be subject to nerf, or it's just overall kind of average compared to everything else. It still brings in the main debate I'm having with it is between an A and a B, because of its team utility like darkness and low cooldown blur with soulbind conduits, and the leech healing is still substantial. You're still going to be doing a lot of healing on Demon Hunter, and I think that you have good synergies with things like Arms Warrior, and you may even potentially have good synergies with other specializations like Feral potentially, because you bring Mortal Wounds now with Honor talents, and this is stuff that you're not really able to test on the beta that I'm trying to take into consideration. Also, when you're thinking about this as well, beta is played at 213 item level, right? That's where your character is set at on the beta, and you have access to all of the Covenant conduits and all the legendaries. When the game actually comes out, you're not going to be 213 item level. You're not going to have all the soulbind conduits, and most of that stuff is unlocked through a time gate, so you're not going to have it for a long time. Let alone your choice of legendaries or an upgraded legendary. So for me personally, I think melee DPS are in a really good position. Right at the start of the expansion, casters aren't going to have the Venthyr, Naja's 25% interrupt reduction for months. And I think just this really big bursty damage from Covenant abilities like the Spear Bastion for the Warrior, or the Chain Harvest from the Enhancement Shaman, or the Hunt from the Demon Hunter. I think that these spells maybe are going to be KOing people. It's going to be really bursty and really melee heavy, which makes me think that Demon Hunter is going to do even better, because it's kind of like the king of the cleave, and it synergizes really well with Arms Warriors. Because of that, I think that Demon Hunter is going to find itself in an A tier position. And it has a little bit more diversity of comp because of its toolkit that is baseline in its kit. But without the Hunt in the place where it was, I think it would fall pretty far from grace, and that is something that could be subject to nerfs. So take that into consideration. Outlaw Rogue, very similar to Assassination. It's the problem is that it's not sub. In PvP, sub is just doing insane damage and has way more stuns. Outlaw actually lost its range stun. You're going back to Kidney Shot, so you had that kind of as an advantage to try over the other rogue specs, but you're going back to Kidney Shot instead. For me, I played against a few Outlaws, and I mean, it was kind of the same old gimmick. Your blind is 30 seconds faster than the other rogue specs, so if a healer trinkets it, then a minute and a half later they're blinded again, can't trinket, and you can try and win in that little window. But outside of that gimmick, it was night and day difference when I fought like a rogue mage with an Outlaw compared to rogue mage with a Subtlety. It was just night and day difference. To me, Outlaw is kind of the hipster spec, just because the big brother Subtlety Rogue is still there at the moment. So for me, I think Outlaw is a solid spec. It's still going to have really good synergies with hunters and mages, just like Assassination would. I think that's just like middle of the road. You do get mortal wounds from the poisons returning to rogue specs, which is great for Outlaw and allows it to compete more with something like Assassination than it did in Battle for Azeroth. And it's just going to have those niche setups and that gimmick with blind that's going to make it work the same way that Frost got that gimmick burst damage and Enhanced got the gimmick healing going on to allow them to work with better classes that are ranked higher than their own classes. But the S tier specs and A tier specs, I think, can have more choice in terms of what they want to play with. Ret Paladin. This is a spec that I think a lot of players, Savics, have said that, oh no, it's dead now because they nerf their burst damage. I still think that Rep Paladin is in a great position. And again, it's because of its hybrid healing, and Word of Glory is limitless in terms of you can just generate holy power, spend it on Word of Glory, keep your team top the entire time, and you still do an immense amount of burst damage during Avenging Wrath. I think with Night Fae, you're going to see high mobility and tons of damage during Avenging Wrath, during Blessing of Summer, or possibly a Kyrian Retribution Paladins, providing Lawbringer with Divine Toll, having a 40% chance to proc Judgment 3 times, bursting a target down out of nowhere. And I think that the meta is going to be hybrid warrior, this type of play style, because warriors are just so good at the moment. And it's going to be maybe more edging into dampening, but the melee DPS hybrid with healing, especially the ones that have limitless healing like Feral and Ret compared to Enhancement Shaman, I think you're going to see a lot of it right off the bat, because the healing is so strong, and casters are going to have no haste at the start of the expansion. It's going to be very slow for them. I think that specs like Ret that would normally struggle with mages and warlocks and shadow priests at the start of the expansion aren't going to have too hard of a time, because those classes are going to have no haste. So I think that its ranking is going to be a little bit higher than you expect, and I still think that has a great position and synergy with things like warrior. For me, I think Retribution Paladin is an A. It's slightly above. I think it's because it's a little bit less of just a gimmick than the other specs. It brings utility like Concentration Aura or Blessing of Sanctuary to remove stuns and fears, which are a little bit more consistent, and its own personal durability is higher than that of something like an Enhancement Shaman. And I'm a bit worried that Arms Warrior Ret or Arms Warrior Demon Hunter is just going to plow over something like a Death Knight or an Enhancement Shaman even, which is tremendous burst damage and then immunity cooldowns, which are going to be more powerful than your Astral Shift. So I think that it brings Rep Paladin above where the current B tier specializations are listed. Subtlety Rogue, this one's easy. It's just going to be doing insane damage, and even despite having the PvE trinkets removed, which I'm very happy to see from Blizzard overall deciding to just gut nerf all the PvE trinkets out of the game. Subtlety Rogue was the #1 abuser of those. Even without the PvE trinkets, I think in the hands of a skilled player, Subtlety Rogue could absolutely dismantle all these compositions, because it has the ability to control the hybrids by stunning them and locking them down to prevent their healing, and it has enough damage to kill them before the stun lock has ended. And that's going to be very important in the meta that I'm anticipating to be hybrid heavy. More so a couple months into the season, I think you'll see casters as they get more haste and they get Ventir interrupt reductions. I think you'll see more and more caster, but at the start I'm expecting it to be melee. I'm expecting it to be hybrids, and I think Subtlety can counter that pretty effectively. Survival Hunter. For me, Survival Hunter, it's got good synergies with things like Feral Druid, obviously, and Feral Druid is in such a strong position, so Feral Druid can kind of like lift Survival Hunter up a little bit. It still has decent kiting and survivability on its own. It's transferring over everything basically from Battle for Azeroth, and Survival is a pretty good spec in Battle for Azeroth overall in terms of performance. I think with Feral Druids being pushed up a bit, and even its synergies with potentially things like Rep Paladin or Subtlety Rogue makes it more competitive, because it's the spec that those specs want to play with naturally, because they synergize so heavily, as opposed to things like the Enhancement Shaman or the Frost Death Knight. I think that Survival Hunter is probably going to come out. Do I want to say that? Because I've been critical of Hunter recently because of the healing output of hybrids. I was worried that it wouldn't have enough damage to be able to execute kills during Freezing Trap. I think with the right class, like a Subtlety Rogue or a Feral Druid, you likely do have enough. And if you're paired up with a Discipline Priest, so compositionally, but as a standalone spec, I think it's in a better place than it's not relying on any gimmicks like Outlaw or any sort of like healing that's too powerful for Enhance or burst damage from Frost. I think that it's an A. It's above average, but not super spectacular. Unholy Death Knight. This is a spec that's less of a gimmick than Frost. I think it's more consistent overall. My main concern with it is if it can stay afloat through all the burst damage cooldowns in the game, the Ferocious Bites, the Sharpened Blades, the Templar's Verdicts, the Chain Harvests, the Subtlety Rogues. For me, it does Unholy have the survivability to make it through those windows like the other hybrids are going to have with their healing output. And I think that it would be, it's slightly less. It's not an S tier spec. I think that it is more solid than Frost and a safer pick in terms of performance than Frost. Although now, see, this is the problem with trying to guess metas, right? If it's a hybrid melee cleave meta, Frost Death Knight will love that. Frost Death Knight will love that meta. Frost Death Knight doesn't like double caster. And I mean, this is literally Frost Death Knight's niche. It's number one in this position. So I'm debating changing the ranking on Frost Death Knight just because of that. I think I have to. If you play with an Arms Warrior and the meta is as I'm expecting it to be, because haste is so low for casters, I think I have to change the ranking of Frost Death Knight, right? Because I'm basing it off the performance of Shadowlands at the end of the beta when the game releases with the meta that I think is going to happen. I think I have to change the ranking of Frost. I think Frost is actually an A tier spec. It's definitely not over the top than S tier, and it's still going to have its niche weaknesses, and it could fall off later, but this assessment is for right now. Changing the assessment on Frost. For Unholy, I think it's still likely the same. We're still being in about the same place where my tier list was previously a few months ago. So, I mean, my estimation wasn't too far off, even despite the nerfs. But I think Unholy is probably on equal ground as Frost. But as the meta shifts potentially, when players are getting more gear, getting more stats, getting more haste, getting more soul binds, I think that we may see Frost Death Knight start to fall off. But initially, I think the Death Knights are in a good spot. And that's also because they also just work with Arms Warrior, right? Like, Arms Warrior is like, hey, Death Knights, I like you. And then the Arms Warriors are just pulling you up a little bit, I think, with the way the meta is going to be at the moment. And then Windwalker Monk, I think now is an S tier. It's above the top. It's got damage buff after damage buff. It's going to be doing a ton of burst damage. It's still one of those hybrids that can heal a lot and has high mobility. Its downsides are going to be against the Subtlety Rogue compositions that lock you down in stuns. But I think, again, with Death Knights getting pulled up again by Windwalkers who love to play with Death Knights, there's going to be high synergy there. That's going to make these specs better than all of the rest when it comes to the game as a whole. So we've got our tier list here, the final conclusion for Shadowlands. You've heard what I've got to say and think. I'd love to hear what you've got to say and think in the comments down below. Do you think I'm totally off base here? Is my information totally invalid? Am I just misleading you with a clickbait tier list? Or is this based off of literally a decade of playing the game and seeing every meta that's ever existed in the game and seeing trends and trying to identify those trends and move forward with the best analysis that we've got? Because I think at the end of the day, right, we all just want to play something that we're going to have fun with, and we also want it to do well. We don't want to pick something that's just going to absolutely fall on its face, unless we're one of those masochistic people like Fury Warriors. And I mean, they like getting hit, I understand, I understand why you want to be going after the Fury Warrior thematically and based off of your decisions. So this is going to be my assessment moving into Shadowlands. You can see that most of the melee are good. It's just really Fury Warrior a little bit behind, and then a couple specs relying on gimmicks. And I think for Assassination, its problem is that it's just not subtlety. I don't think that's a bad spec, but I think in terms of melee specs, it's a pretty good job in terms of balance. Meta, as to whether or not it's going to be a good meta, I think it's like the hybrid melee. It's kind of like going to function like a double healer meta. It's iffy in my opinion as to whether or not I like that meta. I have to wait and see when our item level is lower than 213 if the damage is still going to be relevant outside of cooldowns. That's where my assessment is going to come in for these specs. But this video isn't supposed to be about is the meta good or bad. This is a spec all about the performing specializations, and we've got our list. This is my final conclusion as we move into the release of the game in 4 days. If they release a patch change literally tomorrow, I'll update this, but they didn't release it on the day that they normally release it. Only a couple covenant changes. So this is the information I got. This is the information that I'm running with and I'm rolling with. I hope that it was useful to you in your quest to pick a main. If you enjoy this type of content, please subscribe. I'm going to be updating my ranged DPS tier list for PvP next. I'm going to be updating my healer PvP tier list as well. And those have changed quite dramatically from my initial assessment. So if you want to stay up to date and up into the know-how of my personal opinion, then you'll definitely want to stay subscribed to the channel. I'll have links to other videos up above here as well if you want to check them out, other tier lists, other class recommendations, and such. And again, just trying my best to be a resource for everybody out there. Just want to do a little bit of help here in Shadowlands, as making these types of choices is quite difficult. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.